Hello and welcome to News Desk. This week we're looking at the UK election. Now the centre-right Conservative Party, also known as the Tories, have been in power for 14 years and they've had 5 different Prime Ministers in that time. But now it looks like the party will suffer big losses on Thursday and instead the Labour Party, which is centre-left, is expected to make big gains. Here's the Labour leader Keir Starmer speaking earlier this week.
And I do believe the country wants change. You have been out on the doors, we've been campaigning for a long time now. I'm yet to meet a single person that said to me, look here, everything's great, please don't change anything, it's fine as it is. Nobody is saying that. People want change, but change will only happen if you vote for it.
So that is Keir Starmer there saying that the country wants a change. And that is the question that we're looking at on News Desk today. How will the election change the UK? Will it even change the UK? That's one of the questions we'll certainly be looking at. Hello, welcome to News Desk. I'm Forrest Whiting.
And I'm Michelle Stockman. Definitely, we're going to look at that promise of change. Maybe also people just don't want any more churn.
Yeah.
It's something we're going to be talking about. I will be looking at your comments and your questions in the chat and putting them to our experts and guests who will be joining us today. And thanks to all of you who have already commented on the question that we're talking about today in our community post. I just want to bring out a couple of those already. One from Yongchen8204. Nothing will change in Britain because the policy and things will remain the same. Only people in power look different, argue all the day and all the years without producing any results. So a bit pessimistic there. Kind of joined by Dread Wog Gaming. Labour is not a reset. They're almost identical to the Tories. Same privileged career politicians across the board. Vote reform. So we're going to explain to all of you what all of those are in terms of parties, what they stand for. That's what Dustin is going to help us out with in just a minute. He's going to set the stage for us.
So excited.
But before we come to you, let's go to Cherie, who'll be in the chat and can introduce our poll question today.
Right. Our poll question today is, how should the next UK government engage with the EU? We have 4 options. Keep everything the same, expand cooperation, rejoin the bloc, and cut ties, seek other partners. You will find the poll question on top of your chat, and don't forget to vote.
Yeah, and we're going to have some great guests coming up as well as this fantastic group of us around the table. We're going to be joining DW correspondent Jack Parrock. He is based in Brussels, but he's had lots of experience dealing with British politics, including the last UK election. So really great to have you with us, Jack. Thank you very much for giving up your time. Looking forward to chatting a little bit later. We're also going to have quite a special guest, David Wooding. He is the editor of one of the biggest tabloids in the UK, the Sunday Express, and he has spent many, many years covering politics in the UK. In fact, I even spent some time with him in Westminster, in the House of Commons, covering politics. So maybe we'll have some stories about that. And a bit later, we will be joined by another journalist. He's a broadcaster. He's also a very well-known author. His name is John Kampfner, and he will just be filling us in perhaps a bit on the wider picture of where the UK sits globally, particularly looking at the EU. But first of all, let's just talk to you, Dustin. And we obviously know that there is an election coming. We've known for some time that an election would be coming. But still, when the announcement was made, it took everyone by surprise, didn't it?
Yes, it did. So this is Prime Minister Rishi Sunak calling this snap election just a few weeks ago in May, and it did take people by surprise. And actually, we can show a clip of him calling the election. And if you, just look at the weather, and it looks a bit like he might have caught himself by surprise too.
Only a Conservative government led by me will not put our hard-earned economic stability at risk, can restore pride and confidence in our country, and with a clear plan and bold action, will deliver a secure future for you, your family, and our United Kingdom.
Launching his campaign under a cloud there, so to speak.
I mean, putting aside the fact that the weather was absolutely atrocious and he still decided to go outside Downing Street and make that announcement, he is talking like the new kid on the block, isn't he? Not that he and that his party have been in power for 14 years. It just seems a bit surprising, no?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, the Tories have been in power with 5 prime ministers since 2010, and for a long time. And if you guys want to share my screen, I can show you the map of what it looked like last election. So this is just a map I found from a map nerd on the internet. We will share it in the chat so you guys can have a look at what this is giving. There's different polling on these different maps, right? Like this map. Yeah, basically, there's no big difference between the different polling stations, like small differences, small voting circles, places might have voted differently. But the big takeaway from this map, or from all the election maps, is like this is 2019, with where you can see a lot of Conservative in blue and little Labour in red, and this is what the polling shows now, right? Like.
Yeah.
And you can just see.
What are the different colors again?
Yeah, the different colors. Conservative is blue, red is Labour, and orange is the Liberal Democrats. And then you see some greens, and you see up here, this is the Scottish National Party in light yellow. But the main point is the Tories the Conservatives lost a lot of ground here, and I was hoping Jack could come in on this, and like maybe Jack, you can tell us why is that the case? Why did they lose so much ground?
It was fascinating. In the 2019 election, we saw Boris Johnson promise to get Brexit done, and that really rallied the country behind him. It did get done, but not actually by him in the end. It was Rishi Sunak who finally got the deal over the line fully when the framework is now in place with the European Union. But I think what we saw is the hope of 2019 has dissipated through the Liz Truss leadership of the United Kingdom after Boris Johnson, and now Rishi Sunak. And time just appears to be up for them, whether that's related to Brexit, whether it's related to the scandals around the politicians having parties in COVID, when on the other side we saw the Queen attending her husband's funeral on her own, sat in the cathedral totally alone. And the optics for the Tories have just sort of fallen away from them. And now the Labour Party has this real opportunity to take power when those polls are cast on Thursday now, it seems.
Just, Jack, we're having some questions here, some reaction in the chat. One from Steve Owen. Again, kind of echoing what we said before, not much will change whoever is voted into government. So why do you think there is kind of this sense that, you know, despite this opportunity to switch parties, people might feel not much is going to change?
I think that's a really interesting aspect of this sort of sense of a disillusionment within the UK electorate, that Keir Starmer kind of looks like he's this lawyer type, very sort of metropolitan elite, despite having a regional accent himself. He's sort of got this sense that he's very much looks like the Conservative Party, where his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, was a sort of real lefty, old commie style of Labour politician. But what's interesting is that the policies are different. At the moment, Keir Starmer, what he's basically doing is sort of campaign promise is to change, but he hasn't really outlaid too much. The reason being is he knows by the looks of things, by the polls, he can pretty much win this election without doing too much. The Tories have dug themselves a grave, is the sort of Labour philosophy, I think, on this. And so the people that are voting don't quite see that change yet. I would probably say that when the Labour Party, if they do win in the polls, as we expect them to do, if the polls are correct and are to be believed, I think we will see some major changes, specifically on things like how they deal with the European Union.
OK, thank you very much, Jack. We'll certainly come back to you in a little bit and, you know, talk more about, for example, the EU. But first, I would really like to bring in now David Wooding. He is the editor of the Sunday Express. It's so great to see you, David. It's been some time. David has been on the front line of British journalism for decades, really. He's worked for The Sun, he's worked for the News of the World, he's worked for The Sun on Sunday, he's worked as political editor, and as I said before, we were both working in the House of Commons covering British politics at the same time, and now he is editor of the Sunday Express. That is a very popular tabloid paper, certainly on the right of politics in the UK. So it is really great to have you, David. Thank you very much. And I would just like to pick up really on what Jack was saying. I mean, we've had 14 years of Tory rule and we have had all these different prime ministers, but now there's talk of basically a wipeout. So where do you think it's all gone wrong?
It's absolutely true, Alex, that there is an existential threat to the Conservative Party now, like we've never seen before. And that's a mixture of the problems that have happened, the chaos caused in the wake of Brexit. Most of that, I have to say, caused by Sir Keir Starmer, who opposed honouring the referendum result. That went on for 2 years. No sooner had they got out of that than they were hit by the pandemic, which led to 400 billion being pumped into the economy, spiralling inflation. And of course, the Conservatives then had a few problems with Boris Johnson, who, despite his popularity, they decided to get rid of. And of course, we saw a glimpse of him last night and realised what sort of the wow factor he has, the sort of popular appeal.
Yeah.
And that popular appeal has now been filled by Nigel Farage on the Reform Party. And he's got the mixture of people being fed up with the Conservatives and somebody else who is offering them what they really want.
Well, let's unpack some of that in a moment. But first of all, just to pick up on what you said, you make it sound like you think it wasn't the Conservatives' fault that any of this has happened. You're blaming Sir Keir Starmer, for example, the fact that Brexit took so long to go through, and also that the Conservatives just got rid of Boris Johnson. But you haven't mentioned, of course, the fact that he held these parties during COVID in Downing Street, and that's what upset many, many voters across the board, whether they were Conservative, Labour, whichever party. So some of this is an own goal for the Conservatives, quite a lot.
Undoubtedly, Alex. I'm just saying that there's a general feel of chaos in government. Part of that chaos was the way Boris Johnson ran Downing Street and the people he had around him, and the self-inflicted problems, but two things which added to it with that 2 years of chaos after the referendum, where nothing was done,
and that's
and
the
then
Brexit
we had another
referendum.
year after the Brexit referendum. Nothing was done because the government spent all its time fighting the opponents of Brexit, and then once they got Brexit done, no sooner did that happen than they were hit by a pandemic, which was another 18 months to 2 years of nothing being done because the government didn't have the bandwidth. So you get through 4 years and nothing has been done. The levelling up we're talking about, in other words, investing money in the poorer, poverty-stricken regions of the UK, wasn't done. Because the government just didn't get round to doing it. The new hospitals that were going to be built haven't been built. Yeah. And so, yes, the government hasn't done what it said it would do, but part of that was down to the government being at full stretch on other issues for so long. And of course, the people get fed up with it. And I remember saying at the time, when all this money was pumped into the furlough scheme to protect jobs and businesses, during the early days,
yeah.
Yes, in the very early days, and that was the Chancellor then was none other than Rishi Sunak, now Prime Minister, presently Prime Minister anyway, at least, and he said, I'm saving all these jobs. And I remember saying to my colleagues, it's all well and good spending this money now, but in 2 years down the road, when the country's in debt, taxes are going up, inflation is soaring as a result of this, the Labour Party will simply say, well, look at the mess the Conservatives has got us into. And that is happening now. And the Conservatives are just run out of steam in so many ways. Everything's been against them. They've been against themselves as well.
So can I ask you...
they promised to do, they haven't done.
So can I quickly ask you then, David, why is the Sunday Express backing the Conservatives again for this election?
No, if you read my leader on Sunday, what we said was that the country is calling out for change, and a lot of people are voting for reform, the Nigel Farage party. And what I was saying was that if you want change, the only change you can possibly get in this election is change from Conservative to Labour. Only two people can possibly be Prime Minister on Friday morning. One is Rishi Sunak, the other is Keir Starmer. And my message was, if you don't think Keir Starmer is the man to deliver that change, then the only answer is to vote Conservative. Voting Reform won't get you the change you want, or Lib-Dem or Green or any of the others. It's a protest vote. And a lot of those votes will let Labour in. If you look at one of the polls this morning from Lord Ashcroft, a great pollster who spends a lot of money on really detailed polls, it showed that when people are asked which way they're leaning towards voting, 38% said Labour. Only 19% said Conservative, so half that number. But then 18% said Reform. So if all the Reform voters moved over to Conservative, then it would be neck and neck. It would be 38 to 37.
Okay.
And then when you ask the people who don't know which way they wanted to vote, a lot of the don't know said they would rather have a Conservative government than a Labour government. So people are not buying into Keir Starmer so much as they're fed up with the Conservatives, and some of them are swayed towards Nigel Farage and other parties.
Okay, so,
and that's what's going to do them.
So let's unpack some of those names. Did you want to come in with a quick question? Because I do want to just go back. We want to see who Nigel Farage is. Maybe we want to hear from Boris Johnson, who suddenly joined the Conservatives campaign at very late notice. But first of all, Michelle has just is looking at the chat, and she has possibly a question for you, David.
I do. Well, Alex, you and I were talking before we began the program, talking about a sense for many people that Britain is a broken Britain. And I've got a comment that's just come in that's echoing that from Pridia, saying Conservatives have made things difficult for me and my family. I'm stressing working all day just to bring my wife and kids up. So why is there a sense that the Conservatives have broken the country, and what promises can Rishi Sunak give that would make people vote for Conservatives at this point?
Well, he has given some promises, but the problem is the promises he's giving are ones that have been promised for some time. They promised to bring immigration down to tens of thousands. It was 650,000 last year, 3 times up what it was when Rishi Sunak took the job. He said he'd stop the boats. These are the small boats coming across with migrants from France across the English Channel. He said he would stop the boats. They're getting higher and higher. So both legal and illegal migration has increased. He said he would cut taxes. Yes, taxes have actually reached the highest in 70 years under the Conservatives. And he said he'll fix hospital waiting lists. They've gone up. OK, they're just starting to come down again. The only one he succeeded on, credit to him here, is inflation. He said he would bring inflation down, and it's down to 2%, which is his target. But of course, people will not feel the benefits of that just yet. And perhaps the bank will cut the interest rates in the next couple of weeks, by which time we might well have another government.
I think that Jack Parrock, who's our correspondent in Brussels, just wanted to ask you a quick question, David, and then I want to talk a little bit more about Nigel Farage.
Yeah, I just want to come in here. I think I agree with David that the reform vote, if it did go to the Conservatives, then they would be able to build a much stronger set of numbers to take on Labour. But I think what he's saying there completely ignores the fact that the people that are voting for reform don't want to vote for the Conservatives. It's not a choice but for them. They are fed up themselves with the Conservatives. And also to just come in on the sort of blame of Keir Starmer for Brexit, I think this is a really, especially from a Brussels perspective, the vision that gets pumped, especially from the right-wing press, that it is Labour sort of forced it and stopped it from moving through, is very contrary to the negotiations that happened in Brussels, where the European Union felt that the Conservative Party that under David Cameron held the referendum with no real plan of what they wanted Brexit to look like, then came into the negotiations with no clear plan of how they wanted to get out of the European Union. And then through the negotiations were seen to be changing their main players and negotiators. So I think probably it's a bit of a misnomer, especially from the outside perspective, to be blaming Keir Starmer for this. The big question, and I suppose this is what I would ask David, is what does he expect Keir Starmer to do when it comes to the European Union and returning and having discussions with the EU if he does land as Prime Minister after Thursday's vote?
Yeah, can I just clarify that, what I was saying about Keir Starmer? I wasn't saying he was solely to blame for the Brexit logjam. I was saying he was part of the problem. And yes, undoubtedly, David Cameron, having won 2 previous referendums, one on voting reform and one on Scottish independence, I think he thought he got a bit of a messiah complex and thought he'd get the hat trick and score a 3rd win, and didn't make any plans. And then poor old Theresa May was left to pick up the pieces on that one. So the whole thing was a bit of a mess. But undoubtedly, there were Conservatives who were opposing everything she put up as an idea for different reasons. Some Conservatives were opposing it because they wanted a pure, whole 100% Brexit. And then on the Labour side, they really wanted to go back into the EU and have a second referendum. So between them, and I think Keir Starmer must pay part of the blame for that long, horrible 2 years of chaos that we went through. Back to Nigel Farage. Sorry, your question on that was why the Conservatives, you were making the point that Conservative people who are voting for Farage don't want to go to the Conservatives. I think you're absolutely right. They've given up on the Conservatives, and this is why it's an existential threat. They were people who would traditionally voted Conservative in many ways, who trusted the Conservatives to cut migration, to deliver Brexit, to do all these other things, and they haven't done them. The other thing as well is the number of people, including Labour voters, because we saw in the last election in 2019, lots of the so-called red wall Labour heartland seats, which have been traditionally Labour for many, many years, went to Conservative because they like Boris Johnson. I find that a difficult one to understand because he's a public school boy, not the sort of person you'd expect to be a Labour, to attract Labour voters. Nevertheless, he had a great pull. Nigel Farage has got something similar. And so he's filled the vacuum where Boris has gone, in my opinion. And he's attracting those sort of people who like a good orator. And Rishi Sunak doesn't excite people, neither does Keir Starmer. But Nigel Farage is drawing people over, Labour voters and mostly Conservative voters.
And let's just then park on Nigel Farage, because we have got some pictures of him. He's a populist right-wing former MEP. He has stood for Parliament to become an MP. This will be his 8th time, so he has not succeeded so far. We've got some pictures of him where we can see that he is considered controversial. This is him being having a milkshake thrown over him. I think it's a verb has now been formed, to be milkshaked. There we can see him after that milkshake attack, if we can call it that. But he continues on. He definitely divides the vote, doesn't he, David? And could well win this seat in Essex, in Clacton. It could be the first time that he actually becomes an MP, and many people are expecting him to do that.
Yes, I mean, whatever flavour that milkshake is, with Nigel Farage, it certainly wouldn't be vanilla. He's a bit of a Marmite character in many ways, and he does have a big pull, and people like what he says, and he has a way of saying it in a everyday language which people understand. And similarly, there are people, particularly on the left, who think he's a dangerous man. So, but he does have a big crowd pulling ability. And a lot of those Conservatives who did vote Conservative are now saying, look, we realise from the polls that Rishi Sunak is going to lose this election by a big number. We don't care for voting for them to try and cut the size of the Labour majority. We're going to vote for who we want, and we want somebody like Nigel Farage. And the big question on Friday morning will be what happens to the Conservatives, because some of the future leaders are likely to lose their seats as well. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor,
the Finance Minister.
Yes. And Penny Mordaunt, who is a younger Thatcher sort of character, who's liked by a lot of people. I think 50% of Conservative voters in the recent poll said they wanted her as the leader, and 36% of all voters said she'd make a good prime minister. The nearest one to her, Kemi Badenoch, was at about 14 points, which shows you how far ahead she is.
Okay.
But Kemi Badenoch is ahead of her in the betting because Penny's likely to lose her seat.
OK, so but what about Nigel Farage? I mean, there's talk about him, that the Conservatives may have to do a deal with him in the future, that he could even end up as the leader of the Conservative Party. What do you think about that?
Can I just interject here? It's because he says, just going off that whole milkshake thing, he said, my milkshake brings the people to the rally. So, I mean, it's kind of a play on the Cullis song, my milkshake brings the boys to the yard. I mean, he knows what he's saying there. He does have kind of this way of being a personality. So sorry, go ahead, David. We had to call that out.
And he might not know how to make a milkshake, but he certainly knows how to make a bit of froth. And he's good at that sort of thing.
But what do you think about the Conservative Party?
Well, the suggestions they could merge and form a new party with Farage on board, or indeed they could bring him in. Some senior Conservatives have been talking privately, if he gets elected, of bringing him on board and maybe merging and taking over. I think he wants to destroy the Conservative Party now rather than join it and be part of it, because he's tried to get in it in the past. He's been shoved aside. The only person who's really defeated Nigel Farage, because he's been going on, of course, those who study political history over here, he had a thing called the Referendum Party originally, which was to get a referendum to leave the EU. And then he formed UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party. Then it was the Brexit Party. And now we've got Reform. And they've all been successful and nobody's been able to quite stop them. David Cameron was the only one who did so. What did he have to do? Call a referendum.
Which
that destroyed Nigel Farage. So, of course, defeating Nigel Farage might have its own setbacks in a different way.
And David, just briefly, because I know that you have to go quite soon, we mentioned Keir Starmer. Clearly, you're not a fan. And it seems that other people across the UK have certainly not warmed to him in the same way as other senior politicians. What do you think it is about him that, is not pulling, people are not saying, we want Keir Starmer, they're just voting for the Labour Party?
Well, there isn't a lot of enthusiasm in some Labour circles, I have to say, for Keir Starmer. He is, in fact, a decent man, and he's a good guy, and you meet him close up, as I have done a couple of times, and he's perfectly genuine chap who believes in what he's doing. But he doesn't have that X factor which Boris Johnson, Tony Blair, and to some extent David Cameron had, and neither does Rishi Sunak. So Keir Starmer's in that lucky position, really, of coming into the top job at a time when they've got a party on the turn with a not so popular leader. And I don't think he really needs to do that much. We call it the Ming vase theory here, where he's clinging onto a Ming vase and all he has to do is cross the floor without slipping up, which is why he hasn't said anything exciting, or why he hasn't come out with any eye-catching policies, because he doesn't need to. He's 3 goals up. I wish England had been 3 goals up at some stage, but he's 3 goals up and there's about 15 minutes to go. So he's just walking.
But he's done well, hasn't he, in clawing back the Labour Party, making it more electable, because back in 2019 it was led by Jeremy Corbyn and was considered much further left. So he has done a good job there internally, even if he hasn't reached all those voters in the popularity stakes.
And therein lies one of the conundrums about Keir Starmer. He's described as a flip-flopper. In fact, the Conservatives brought out some spoof beachside flip-flops the other day with Keir Starmer's face on it. He keeps coming up saying one thing, and then a little bit later he might change his mind. He said during the last election that Jeremy Corbyn would make a great prime minister. He later went on and banned him from the Labour Party and now says, we have changed. He said he wanted a second referendum on Brexit. And then in an interview with the Sunday Express a few months ago, he said, Brexit is safe in my hands. We're not leaving the single market. We're not leaving the customs union. We're not going back into orbit with the ECJ. So things he says people wonder whether he will change or not. The other one was the green policy. There was this huge policy for net zero, which is equally being ditched because it's going to cost too much. So, yes, it's difficult to nail down what he's going to do, but he's got a big task ahead if he gets this job tomorrow, and people will probably not give him too much time to see some change. So we've got a very, very big task ahead.
David, just before you go, I know you have limited time here, but we've got a question from CF Video, who talks about a time that they met you at Labour's last election at Battersea. I don't know if that brings up memories for you. But
he said in a helicopter, in a Sun helicopter, is what he says in that comment.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So
it was the days when newspapers had money.
Well, your paper, is backing the Conservatives. So CF Video is asking, do you think the Tory plea to wavering voters to return will work?
I probably won't, really. I think the die is cast now. I think we'll get a Labour government tomorrow, and it's a case of how big it'll be.
And how would that, do you think, change the UK having a Labour government, David?
Well, first of all, to be fair to Keir Starmer, he'll have a myriad of problems to deal with. Everything from benefit culture here to making Brexit work, even stopping the migrants, cutting those NHS waiting lists. There's a whole pile of problems in his in tray, and then he's got to find out where to get the money from to do the reforms he wants. So I can't see where he's going to get the money from to do the change he brings. Perhaps the only change we'll really see is a change of personnel at the top. But I'd like to think that he could at least make some inroads into some of the problems that people are crying out for change on.
David Wooding, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for some of them very close up and detailed. So thank you very much for that. Really great to have you on the stream, and do have a good election. We look forward to seeing what your take is and your paper's take is on Sunday. So thank you very much. And Jack Parrock is still with us and was listening to that. And Jack, I know that you also had a question there for David that we didn't quite answer, but I would just like to know what your take was on what he was saying generally. I know you called him up on a couple of his points about, for example, Keir Starmer and Brexit. But I'm just wondering, what's your take on that, particularly perhaps what he was saying about reform and about Nigel Farage and still voting Conservative?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the Nigel Farage phenomenon, to be honest. He's kind of the spot that the Conservative Party hasn't been able to squeeze for decades now. And actually, if he wins this Clacton seat, maybe it's obviously going to give him that stage within the House of Commons. He's going to have a parliamentary seat. He used his seat here in the European Parliament very well. He was really good at getting people to club around him, which meant that he was a leader of a group, which meant he could speak regularly. He was very affable with everybody in and around Brussels. He was a member of Parliament for many, many years in the European Parliament. And I think I have the same take as David. I actually don't think that he wants to become the leader and merge with the Conservative Party. I think he's probably more bent on destroying it. Whether he can do that from the inside if he wins a seat, that's the real big question. And for Keir Starmer as a prime minister, potentially, I also have the same take. I think the die is cast. The polls are so far gone that I think if you are a Brit going to cast your election ballot in this election, you're unlikely to want to vote for the Conservatives when all you're hearing is they're probably going to lose. You sort of want to feel like you're on the side of history. So perhaps they'll vote for Labour. And then the big question is, OK, we'll find out a bit more about what Keir Starmer actually wants to do as Prime Minister. He's not been saying very much. Yeah. But for me, the big question is, what does a Conservative opposition do? How do they try and reform themselves to look like, after 14 years, and especially the last 5 years, which have been a real descent into sort of chaos, frankly, on certain issues. I mean, the Liz Truss leadership
we haven't even mentioned her, have we? Liz Truss.
I mean, across the board, a disaster, right?
And Liz Truss, just quickly.
What are they going to do to counter the Labour Party? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just going to say Liz Truss was Prime Minister for how many days was it in the end, Jack? Was it 50?
44?
44?
I think it was 4 days, less than a
and
lettuce.
basically,
Wasn't it?
she pretty much, I think we can say, she upset the markets a lot with her unfunded tax cuts. So she didn't last long.
She tanked the economy.
Yeah, so it's okay. But let's say it tougher.
It was an unmitigated disaster.
Yeah, so her experiment at trying to give a shock to the UK economy that she said it needed trickle-down economics. But yeah, as we saw.
And just quickly, Jack, you're sitting in Brussels. What is the view about this British election? Do they even care? Do they care now that Britain is not a member of the European Union? Is it irrelevant or is it important?
I mean, sure, they care. They were like European Union institutions and all of the pro-EU forces and political forces were sad to see the UK leave after Brexit. But they've also had enough of it. To be perfectly honest with you, there is no EU official who is willing to go into extended negotiations with the UK. Obviously, there's still things that they need to iron out and discuss. There's always political issues with such close geographical neighbours. But from an EU perspective, this is over. But that doesn't mean that Keir Starmer can ignore it. Like David was saying, there's no clarity on what he actually wants. We knew that he was a Remainer, that he wanted the UK to stay in the European Union. But what's interesting in the run-up to this election, as Keir Starmer as leader, he has not been making any overtures. I've been speaking to lots of different officials, both from the member states and in the European Union's institutions. They're not really talking very much with the Labour Party at the moment. So they don't know what a Labour government is really going to mean for UK relations with the European Union as well. But Keir Starmer can also annoy people if he comes in as Prime Minister, makes this big sort of pro-EU play. That will probably upset a lot of people and bring a lot of ire, especially from the Conservative right and from figures like Nigel Farage, who will have a big drum to beat if he does decide to do that.
Yeah, and hold that thought, because we might look at that in a bit more depth a little bit later. But first of all, I just want to bring in our next guest. This is John Kampfner. He is a journalist, he's a broadcaster, he's an author. He has worked for many, many different media organisations, from the BBC to the Financial Times to the Telegraph. He was editor of the British magazine The New Statesman. He writes for so many different publications and is on so many different media outlets that I can't go through them all. He's also written several books, very successful books. The latest one is about Berlin, a very good read if anybody's interested. And he's also a senior associate fellow at the think tank RUSI, which stands for the Royal United Services Institute in London. And that sort of looks at defence, security and sort of international relations. So, John, thank you so much for joining us. Particularly thank you because I know you have just got off a plane from the United States. So you've probably got a little bit of jet lag. So really, many thanks for joining us. I'd just like to start with the US and ask you, were they talking about the UK election? Did they know who Keir Starmer was, or were they completely focused on what's going on across the Atlantic?
Thank you very much, Alex, for that long and kind introduction, and for which I won't do justice because I'll answer your question with a straightforward no. There is precious. I mean, you'll get bits and pieces on in the New York Times, Washington Post, whatever in the foreign pages about the British elections. Less than there is about the French elections, which are seen as more dramatic, and I think they play to American anxieties more accurately. But the vast majority of American concern at the moment is, will Joe Biden last it through to the elections? And more importantly, should he?
Yeah, OK.
I just want to add here, reacting to the awareness of Starmer, Mr. 29193 says Starmer is playing dead all the way to number 10. So
that's pretty harsh. I have to
pretty
say.
hard about the kind of the impact he seems
to be having an impact. John, just overall in this election, in this British election campaign, we've heard very, very little about foreign policy. I mean, is there a reason why? Is that intentional, or is that just because voters in the UK are not interested?
Foreign policy usually does not play a big part. In most countries, general elections, parties tend to be voted on their records on all the big public policy issues, health, education, the economy, nowadays immigration. In Britain, the number one issue remains Europe and Brexit, but there has been an omertà. I mean, neither Labour, which in my view absolutely should be talking about Europe, and nor the Conservatives, who would love to be banging on about Brexit and dividing lines with the Labour Party, but they realise that the vast majority of Brits, whether they realise it or not, know that it has been an economic and national disaster for the country. So the big issue is pretty much off the table.
And has that has that surprised you that after all those years of talking about Britain leaving the European Union and then watching Brexit play out from 2016 till it was finally done in 2020, even later if we take into account Rishi Sunak making these final deals with the EU, does it surprise you that it's just not being talked about?
The 2019 general election.
No, sorry, Brexit.
That is part of my answer. The 2019 election that Boris Johnson won was the Brexit election. Yeah. This was a conservative, privately educated, pompous buffoon winning over working class voters with the simple mantra, get Brexit done. That was the whole reason why he won. He persuaded quickly after the chaos of the early period under Theresa May, but that it would be a spectacular success. And even the most ardent Brexiteers, even Nigel Farage, agree that it has been a failure. Their argument is usually, oh, it was done wrongly. The blob, the deep state prevented us from having a real Brexit and that kind of thing. So to answer your question, because 2019 was the election in which Boris Johnson created this artificial coalition of traditionally Labour supporting voters, particularly in the north of England, the so-called Red Wall voters, he won them over to the traditional Conservative base. And those people, more than anyone else, have been bailing out of the Conservatives this time.
So do you think then, looking at Europe in particular now in relations with the EU, do you think anything will change if there is very likely to be a Labour government in place by Friday?
Keir Starmer is going to be testing the water. Slowly, there is a meeting of the European political community, this new informal group that President Macron wanted to take place, and this will now be its fourth meeting, and that's within 10 days of Starmer taking over, which I think we all have to regard as an inevitability. That will give him an opportunity to glad hand. The important thing for him is to reassure Europeans that Britain, once again, after a gap of 8 years, can be seen as a reliable and trustworthy country. I mean, I remember one European ambassador saying to me that his government now works from the view that if Boris Johnson told them it was sunny outside, they'd have to actually look at the window to check if that was the case. In other words, you couldn't believe a word that the Brits said, which is very much against the old stereotype view of the Brits. He needs to recreate that view that Britain can be a steady partner, and he needs to convince British voters step by step. I don't think they need any more convincing, but he kind of feels that they do, that small improvements, whether it's going to be veterinary stuff that will help them with their pets traveling, whether it's going to be mutual recognition of professional qualifications, whether it's loosening, probably the most important thing, loosening border controls so it's not so difficult in both directions to get across if you have different passports, to make the lived experience of Europe unthreatening and positive for Brits again. Once he's got through that hurdle, will he or won't he, and I don't know the answer to the question, and probably he doesn't yet know, go further than that? But absolutely, the sense of deliberate stoking of antagonism, which is what the Conservatives were doing from 2016 pretty much until now. I mean, Sunak toned it down, to give him credit. but it is still seen as an adversarial relationship. And I think that's the most important thing that Starmer will try to change.
I'd like to bring in Jack, who is our correspondent in Brussels, who's been listening to that as well. And Jack, just with what John was saying there about, certainly Keir Starmer will immediately try to improve, I suppose, the optics between the UK and the EU. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what John's saying. And I also think Keir Starmer's got a really good position here. From an EU perspective, it really can't be that much worse. All he has to do is come and have discussions in faith, not say really inflammatory things and say that the EU is like, a Soviet state, like one of the previous UK Brexit negotiators said. Just anything that feels tame and reasonable and sort of logical will be accepted by the European Union. I will say I also agree with John about Rishi Sunak. One thing that Rishi Sunak definitely did well was this re-agreement of the big issues that existed on the border with Northern Ireland. It was called the Windsor Framework. They signed it in Windsor. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, went over. Sunak did it with all the pomp and circumstance that the Europeans like, a sort of big signing ceremony and everybody on the same side. And Sunak did actually do that very well from an EU perspective. And I think Keir Starmer will look at that. He'll say, how do these Europeans like to work? And they like to have these sort of statements of solidarity where everybody's on the same page, where it all looks like we're all working towards a goal. It doesn't necessarily, again, have to be big announcements. I know there's a lot of people that hope that that a Labour government would potentially bring the UK back into the Erasmus scheme, where students can travel between universities and study. I think those things that John was mentioning as well, the travel on the borders and the roaming fees for mobile phones for Brits going on holiday in Spain and Portugal and Greece, etc. Those are the things that are very favourable to voters. Whether Starmer will try and move and get back into those schemes quickly, or whether he'll do it drip by drip, I think with him there will be a willingness from the European side to at least restart some of those negotiations. Yeah. Just on the other side, he's going to have to start talking to other EU leaders as well. And it's going to be interesting to see who he goes to first. Will he go to Chancellor Scholz, same political centre-left leaning, and Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish centre-left prime minister, or will he try and work more clearly with some of the more tricky and difficult factors in the European Union? Who will he talk to? Yeah. And we'll see at that political community summit that John was talking about just after the elections, how he angles that if, as we expect, he does get put into the position in number 10. And
it looks like he will be making a visit to Berlin here in Germany to visit Chancellor Scholz at some point in the summer in August. Certainly that's what we're reading. Michelle, you had something.
That's right. This is for John. A lot of the people who are participating in the chat, for them, a big question is about immigration. And, there's the perception that under the Conservatives, the door was trying to be closed on immigration to the UK. And Carolina Valina is asking, what about the plan for immigrants? And also, Peter Devine says, Rwanda is a dead duck, but Starmer will have to sort it out. So can you give us a sense of how Starmer's going to move forward
explain what Rwanda is as well?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So Rwanda was this scheme that Rishi Sunak cooked up, which was immigrants who had got to the UK illegally, in other words, not through the normal accepted routes, would be sent to this African country with a fascinating record. I mean, I know Rwanda quite well. Sadly, I had to cover the massacres there about 30 or so years ago. And under Paul Kagame, it has hugely changed and become a thriving country, but at the expense of human rights. So it is a country with a dubious human rights record, which tried to persuade the Brits, and the Brits were open to persuading the Conservatives, that is, that it was a place that would have been economically profitable for the Rwandans, who were going to be paid handsomely to take in these refugees. There were constant illegal battles, constant attempts to round people up and ship them out. The cost was supposed to be for each person taken away and housed in Rwanda was more than a night in a posh suite at the Ritz Hotel. The plan was you can argue against it both on ethical reasons, but also on practical reasons. It was a totemic and rather silly way of trying to deal with a migration issue. There is a much more fundamental question, which is what is the correct number of people that any particular country wishes to absorb, whether they're legal or illegal. And the vast majority of the influx into the UK and into other countries as well, I mean, Canada's got a huge influx of refugees, for example, they go down the legal route. And you can quite easily increase the numbers, decrease the numbers by all kinds of changing of the visa requirements. So this in many ways was a red herring. It was designed to divert attention from the Conservatives' terrible maladministration. And that is going to be that is Starmer's promise. I mean, it's what all governments do.
That he will get rid of this Rwanda scheme.
The absolute day one, that is gone. That is absolutely gone. That is one of those ones that he hasn't pushed back on. He's toned down, watered down a lot of his promises. That is absolutely clear. And the reason he's so clear about it is that everybody, pretty much apart from a few totemic supporters of this scheme, but even many Conservatives thought it was a crazy scheme. But Starmer will promise to tighten up borders. He's going to he's going to bring in some kind of military or defense or security type to be in charge of border security. He wants to talk tough on, and I've always argued, and most immigration people who know anything about immigration argue, that it's much less an issue of principle, and it's much more an issue of administration. How good are you at letting people in, integrating them, and or kicking them out if they've overstayed their welcome or if they have no reason and no human rights reason to stay if they've come illegally. So I think that will remain a toxic issue because the far right and Nigel Farage will keep it that way, and it's kept that way all across Europe. Can I just come back on one wider point that Jack's remarks allowed me to do, and that is there's another role for Keir Starmer, which is absolutely fascinating. If you look, obviously, and you guys have been doing a lot of work on the French elections. I spend half my time in Berlin, and so I see the German political scene up close the whole time, and it is very fragile. The three-party traffic light coalition under Olaf Scholz is in a mess in so many different ways. So you have the irony of ironies about to happen, in which the UK, the country that was seen as the party island, the sort of place where clowns and buffoons pretended to be prime ministers, suddenly becoming ultra serious again, ultra responsible, somewhat dour, somewhat boring, perhaps, somewhat Scholzian, but with a large majority. And so Keir Starmer actually is going to be one of the most powerful politicians, not in the EU, because obviously the Brits are not in it, but in the continent of Europe. And he's going to have a lot to say and a lot of influence, I think, on all these issues where social democrats and mainstream politicians in general are struggling.
Can I just jump in here? We've got a comment from one of the users, Tinashe, and he says, the part I find most fascinating about this election as a non-Brit is that in the past few years, it really does seem as if the lead that Britain had before in being a global leader has been evaporating. So are you saying that Keir Starmer is going to regain some of that ground that was lost under the Conservatives?
Some of it. A lot of it is just historical inevitability, and the Brits have been trying to defy gravity on all of this, with all the sort of talk of the special relationship with the United States and all that kind of thing. You know, Britain is fast becoming, and should learn to be comfortable in being, a middle-ranking power. There are so many countries around the world that are emerging as significant powers, and no prime minister of any competence or any color can change that fact. But the extent to which Britain was held in disrepute with one huge exception, it must be said, the Ukraine policy has been incredibly enlightened, in my view, and fast to react and steadfast. But if you take the, albeit important, Ukraine policy out of the equation, Britain has been nowhere on so many of the big European and global decisions, and its reputation, thanks a little bit to Theresa May, well, a little bit to David Cameron, a little bit to Theresa May, a huge amount to Boris Johnson, also to Liz Truss, but she wasn't there for long enough, and a little bit to Rishi Sunak. It has been a hammer house of horrors in terms of global leadership for the UK. So it will definitely regain some ground, but only a bit.
A hammer house of horrors is a phrase there. Jack, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I really, really agree with John. I think it's super interesting that Keir Starmer will have, if the polls are to be believed, a serious majority. And this is actually a big question for the Europeans. And what they want to know is he going to focus entirely on trying to rebuild domestic policy? He definitely has to do that, rebuild domestic trust in politics. Or will he try and follow the more Tony Blair, mega globalist, best friend of the Americans? That will also probably depend on what happens in the US elections coming. Another thing about trust and migration that John was talking about, if I can pick up on that, one of the things with the small boats that leave the French coastline and arrive on the Kent coastline in the UK that is such a toxic political issue is that the French, if we're honest, they haven't said this publicly, but it's well known, have very, very little sort of desire to help the UK on this. They've been entrenched on either side of the channel. The Brits demanding that the French help to prevent the boats from coming. The French saying that they're doing it, but also don't want tons of migrants sort of camping out on the French coast. And Keir Starmer may actually, rather than just real hammerhead policies patrolling the sea, he may be able to come to an agreement with some sort of better feeling with the French government to try and stop that from happening. That as well depends on the French parliamentary elections, because on Sunday there could be a far-right prime minister opposing President Macron in France that could snarl up French politics. So Keir Starmer's got a lot to do, but he's also going to have to operate in the world in which is going to not just exist now, but is going to change quite significantly before Christmas for sure.
Thank you, both of you. Just pause there a second. I'm hoping now that Cherie, we can just pop to Cherie now and just ask her what's going on in the chat, because we've had a few questions and comments from Michelle. But what's the feeling about the election and about whether it is going to usher in change, whether in the UK, whether on more of a global stage?
Yeah, just to answer your question about if people think that the election would make any change, there's actually a comment that I find quite representative. Someone said that Labour will just double down on bad policies the Tory had since they agree on most policies. Tories were just a Labour light. So I think many people express this opinion that they don't think there will be any change. But there are also many polarizing opinions on many different issues. First of all, on Starmer that we were talking about, Chris Brenner said that Starmer is another puppet of the ultra-elites. But someone also said that Starmer will create jobs and help the poorest in the country. And then also there are people expressing their opinion about Brexit. Again, it seems that it's still a topic in their mind. Some people say that they should have had a hard Brexit, regaining their sovereignty. And then some said that they shouldn't have. Brexit has cost them billions of money already. So in the chat, there are many polarizing opinions.
Yeah, and different views on who they're voting for, I guess, as well.
I would say a lot of dissatisfaction across the board within the chat with the status quo.
And that's something that you were just talking about there, Jack, weren't you, talking about trust? You were putting it in context with immigration and small boats. But this whole issue of trust is a problem, isn't it, for not just the UK, but globally when it comes to politicians. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think this is exactly it, Alex. Like, this is the hand that Keir Starmer plays. I am not particularly interesting. I am relatively officious. I'm a barrister, but I'm just not chaos. That's kind of his current political sort of position, and it's working for him, right? After many years of so much turbulence in the UK. I know people, anecdotally, in the UK who would never have voted Labour in their whole lives, who have stood ardently by the Tories for the whole time that I've known them, who have told me that they're going to vote Labour. This is a real shift in UK politics. But what is also interesting is the other parties that are coming into the mix here. The Reform Party, the Lib-Dems look like they're going to do kind of okay. Ed Davey, their leader, has been sort of swinging from bungee jumps and winning a lot of public support.
We've got some. We have actually got some pictures
really weird
of those.
election.
It is weird. We have actually got some pictures of Ed Davey, just if anybody is interested. This is the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party. It's currently the third, has been the third party, but could well, they're talking about it, could well overtake the Conservative Party in terms of votes at this election. But this is what he's had to do to get attention from the public and from the media. He has been bungee jumping. He's been on... Is that a roller coaster? Well, he's been at the fun fair. He's been doing all kinds of crazy things to try. Oh, there! Look, I mean,
He also,
this is the leader of a
he also did something really serious, though, Alex. He also did something really, really serious, and he released a video of himself talking about the care work that he does for his family, having grown up as a carer, and it really, really post-COVID struck a very, very sort of, I mean, anyone, whatever political party you're from, you can feel that really closely, what he went through. And to expose that sort of personal story of his has played really, really well in this election and may actually do him quite well. As you say, there is some polling that suggests the Lib Dems could be the official opposition after the vote.
Can I just ask one thing, like as like a German person who's just looking at this kind of from the outside, the British politics seems like such a circus at times. Like, is that not, eating away on voters' confidence in politicians? I think, like, you know, things like that. Like, why is he not trying to convince with policy?
Let's put that. Let's just put that to John Kampfner. John, if you were listening to that, that was Dustin, who's sitting around the table with us. He's a German, and he's asking, as an outsider, you know, why is this not looking more serious? Do people not want more policy?
Yeah, I mean, my previous book, Why the Germans Do It Better, was all about juxtaposing circus politics with serious politics. And I remember quoting a Berlin friend of mine saying that she had given up her Netflix subscription because she got all the entertainment she needed watching the British Parliamentary Channel. So you have that sense of politics which prized rhetoric and performance over delivery. And Germany is the exact juxtaposition. I do wish Olaf Scholz would learn. I'm not even sure he's capable, he's just not that way inclined to communicate. Because I do think communicating to voters, telling them straightforwardly with empathy, with clarity, what you are trying to do, what you're not able to do, what the situation is, rather than being the besserwisser and the person who just says, leave it to me, I'll sort it out and I'll tell you the results afterwards. So there is probably a happy medium between the two. What I would say on the point about the third party, the Liberal Democrats in the UK, is if you take, according to the Financial Times and to other opinion pollsters, if you take what is predicted to be the aggregate share of the vote of the Conservatives and Labour at this general election, and that combined share is expected to be the lowest in a century. And what that means is two things. First of all, there is increased interest in the other parties. The far-right Reform Party of Nigel Farage, and how well it does is going to be the really important second story in Thursday's elections. The Liberal Democrats we've spoken about, who will do well in reasonably affluent suburban seats that are more pro-European. The Green Party, which is an important party, but because of our political voting system, very rarely gets anywhere. Does that get more than one seat, which it normally has? Might that get 3 or 4 and what's going to happen in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So there are a lot of other things going on in that. But what it is saying also, if you compare what is expected to happen this week with Keir Starmer with 1997 and Tony Blair's victory, his landslide, which I remember well. I remember announcers on the London Underground, on the U-Bahn, cheering and telling people what the results were. I remember people opening bottles of champagne and dancing in the streets. There will be none of that this time. This is predominantly a vote of despair and a vote for, as Keir Starmer wants it, a vote for change. But it is not a hugely, oh my God, look at this Keir Starmer, look at this Labour Party, we desperately want them. It is, for most people, the lesser of all the different evils.
And I mean, it's a very good point you make. I just want to pick up on one thing. You're talking about the UK election, the electoral system. Just for anyone who isn't aware of this, it is not a PR system. So it's not about proportional representation. It is first past the post. And that is why even if a party such as the Reform Party under Nigel Farage gets a lot of votes, they may not win the seats. So that's why, that's what John is referring to with that. John, I have one last question. I don't know if Michelle has anything in the chat, but I have one last question which is basically what we've set up for this whole news desk. How will the election change the UK? Do you think the election will change the UK?
In and of itself, no. The election could, medium term, change the UK if Keir Starmer has some courage, has some fair wind, and puts on his helmet and I'm mixing all my metaphors now, and dodges all the bullets and gets on with some serious reform and repair across all our public services, which are, you know, the National Health Service is close to collapse, the education system is poor, housing is desperate, transport is creaking, the economy is stagnating. There is a huge amount of work. And if he makes progress, and if he then wins in 4 or 5 years' time on the basis of a solid and good performance, then Britain, after 10 years, which is the timeline that he has given himself, could be a changed and improved country. But there's another scenario where he gets bogged down, he struggles at every turn, and then don't rule out a takeover of the Conservative Party in opposition by Nigel Farage or somebody like him, it becoming a Trumpian far-right party and it winning next time round, even with a Labour landslide this time around, simply because voters are no longer stuck with one party for a long time. They are very capable of flipping from one election to another. So this is high stakes. Britain could be on the road to recovery, or this could just be a temporary blip as we descend once again into this awful vortex of right-wing politics that we hope we're coming out of now.
John Kampfner, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your insights. It was really good to talk to you. I think probably you need to have some sleep now after your jet lag to recover from that. But you will be, I'm sure, bright and ready to vote tomorrow in the election. Thank you very much again, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
And still with us is Jack Parrock in Brussels. Jack, you've been with us throughout, and we appreciate that. I hope Jack is still there. I'd just love to get... He is, great. I just love to... There you are. Hi, Jack. I just, you know, with what was just said there by John, that, you know, this could be 10 years, this could be change, or this could be 5 years, and it's sort of back to what we've already had. What's your view on that?
I've got a slightly different take, actually. Firstly, I'd like to say to Dustin, this is how we do British politics. It's got to be the sparks and the chaos. I'm sorry, I don't know why. It's just how we do it. And I know German politics is much more straightforward. American politics pre-Trump was always a bit more chill as well, for instance.
Can I just say, as an American...
Let me just go on the record. It's not like
this is really tame.
Yeah, let me just go on the record and say, it's also not like I'm a huge fan of German politics, but it just, from an outside perspective, the main thing I'm always seeing is like someone's hair is being discussed. You know, Boris Johnson's hair is being discussed, and then like the bungee jump stuff, the milkshake stuff. That's what you see if you look at like British politics from the outside. That's the kind of the stuff that sticks with you. That's why I asked that question.
It's also the media atmosphere, though, the way in which we report things in the United Kingdom, that tabloid press, that sort of push, cut and thrust. Today's newspaper is tomorrow's fish and chip paper. That's kind of how we exist. So we need those punchy headlines. And I think that's always been the case in UK politics. Just quickly on whether this will change the UK. I personally think that a Labour win, as we predict and as we expect from the polls, will actually shift the mentality of the UK. There's been so much negative sentiment towards what's happened with the Tories that have shifted leaders so many times. I think that the public just want to be able to breathe out for a second. And I think I agree with what John was saying. There will be a lot of issues that Starmer has to face. But if he can just sort of ride on that just chill moment for the British public, he can actually create a foundation where he can build something. And the Conservatives will have to mount a really, really big fight 5 years afterwards. He just needs to be not plagued by scandal. Yeah. That's my take.
You know, Jack, you had mentioned that you think for a lot of people, Keir Starmer will bring a sigh of relief. And, you know, we're seeing here in Europe actually kind of a swing to the right when it comes to voter trends. But we have a question here from Language of Football asking, why is the UK bucking the trend in Europe and most of the Western world by rejecting the right and going left? What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is a strange idiosyncrasy of sort of political fortunes from what we're seeing. We've just in the last 24 hours seen a new Dutch coalition cabinet voted in, appointed by the king. They're going to be backed. He's not in the cabinet, but the very, very Islamophobic and racist Geert Wilders, who's said that he wants to ban the Quran, for instance, in the Netherlands. He's going to be the sort of shadow figure. He has members of his party as ministers in that cabinet. We have seen in France now, we've got the second round of this election, this big swing to the far right of the Rassemblement National, the national rally of Marine Le Pen, who's run off against Macron for the last two presidential elections. I think what it is, maybe the UK was just a bit ahead of the curve in that sense. The Conservatives were really, really dragged by the right that made David Cameron, the right-wing factions, dragged him into this Eurosceptic policy, which means that he then decided to hold that referendum, and then the sort of everything that's unfolded in the 8 years since then has been really, really difficult for the UK. And so now it's just a shift in the other direction, as perhaps the other countries are shifting in, towards the far right parties at this time. It's a bizarre situation, actually, and it was really interesting. I think John's completely right in what he was saying, that we will have Starmer is a left-wing, but a relatively centrist left-wing politician with a big majority, which is not really the prevalent way of doing politics in Europe at the moment. It will be a real hark back to the sort of 80s and 90s, where politicians enjoyed big majorities in their parliament and could really swing their weight in the international sphere. Whether Starmer does that, we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you for all your time that you've given us. It's been really fascinating, especially to get not just all the, the corridor gossip and stuff of what's going on in Brussels, but also because you have spent quite a lot of time covering the UK and politics in the UK as well. So we really appreciate that. Thank you very much. And
really
Cherie,
interesting show. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's been great. And Cherie, we can't leave until we know what the result is of that poll. So just remind us of the question and what the results have been.
Yeah, so the poll question again. How should the next UK government engage with the EU? We've got 346 votes. The first option that most people vote for is to rejoin the bloc, actually. 44% of people voted for this. And then 21% voted for expand cooperation, 19% voted for keep everything the same, and 14% voted for cut ties.
Ties,
other partners.
That's
so
tough, yeah.
it looks like everyone wants to be wants the UK to be closer to the EU again.
A lot of EU nostalgia.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, very much for being with us. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for staying with us. It's been great. Also, a big thank you to Dustin. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to Cherie.
That's
And
right.
to Michelle. And to Michelle, of course.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, so we'll be back next week on Wednesday. We put up our question about 24 hours ahead of time, so take a look and we'll see you again next week.
Bye-bye. See you then.